Hello fellow crafters, I'm Karen, and in this video I'll be explaining how to research, design, and plan a fairy garden building. I want to split this video into two sections, one for research and analysis and another for design and planning. The first section is more about understanding what makes a fairy garden building, and the second is more about how to plan to design your own. So for research and analysis, the first step is really to determine what's already out there. What defines a fairy garden building? What makes it a fairy building as opposed to just a normal building or a miniature of a normal building? So the way I went about that is just to look at a lot of pictures. So I was searching for fairy gardens, fairy houses, just fairies, and then in addition to that, things like cottages or whimsical houses or decorations like fairy decor or fairy art. And all of that was to try and understand what other people agree makes something have to do with fairies. And then from there, I just decided what I liked and saved those pictures. That's where the analysis starts to come in. First, you have to analyze, why do I even like it? So what feature caught your attention? Was it the structure? Was it just part of the structure? Was it the colors they used? Is it the surroundings? Is it the materials that make it distinct? And then from there, I started to look at what makes it distinctly fairy. So I tried to note some of the trends that I noticed in the pictures that I looked at. And some of the things that I saw were that they're almost always small. The idea is that they're kind of scaled inside, but not to their surroundings. And what I mean by that is, unlike a dollhouse or like your standard Christmas village building, fairy buildings are built to sort of fairy proportions. So the door is the right size for a little tiny fairy to fit through, but there are no tiny pine trees outside, so which would imply that it's just a tiny version of the real thing. So the fairies really are supposed to fit in the tiny nooks and crannies of our world. So what you see in the landscaping is things like mushrooms, where a tiny mushroom to us is the size of their house, or it's part of their house. And that creates that dimension and indicates that this is a tiny thing that we've actually blown up as opposed to shrunk down from a larger building. I also noticed that there were a lot of insects or pieces of pottery, things that you associate with a garden or just being outdoors. A lot of the buildings or parts of buildings were made from things in nature. So you've got your leaves and sticks, your mushrooms, tree stumps, tree bark, anything that you could theoretically go out into a forest and find might be incorporated into one of these buildings. There is a tendency for them to be very whimsical, so the buildings are sometimes crooked, or there's just something that stands out that we would not do with a normal house, but that you would see. So, for example, you might see a lot of features in a small area where you've got like too many windows for the building, or multiple doors, or several chimneys, or there are a lot of stairs and different types of stairs. So you got ladders and suspended stairs and all sorts of twisted stairs, things like that. So extra features seem to be pretty common. And then there was often an abnormal shape of the general structure or a feature of the structure. So you might have a building that is two stacked spheres, or you might have a huge curved roof, or a roof that comes all the way from the top all the way to the ground. So there were a bunch of things where you might find that it wouldn't look right if it were a real house, but those are the types of things that are common among the fairy design. So the second section here is to design and plan your own building. The first thing that I did here are to determine what those common features were that I was just mentioning. And I actually made a chart, which I will put up on the screen here, to show those trends. This chart shows not rigid categories, but just the general ideas that I was seeing. So it outlines the options that you have for any part of your fairy building. So that may mean that you want to start with a single stump and build a tree house that's covered in bark with a mushroom top for a roof and stairs that wrap around the trunk and asymmetrical doors and windows. And then maybe you add some lights and landscaping features along with that. And the idea that I was trying to get at with this chart was just, if I picked one item from each column, I could define a plethora of different fairy garden buildings, depending on which ones I chose. So you can start with this chart, or you might make your own based on what you've observed in the images. But once you've chosen your features, you want to be thinking logically about the process to build it. So from an artistic side of it, you want to create kind of an aura or an impression. Depending on what type of building you're choosing, and I had a separate chart where I, based on the building that I wanted to create, I selected an item from that original chart to define the structure. So if you're making a bakery, naturally a bakery would have to have an oven. So it probably ought to be made out of stone, not something like leaves or sticks. It wouldn't make as much sense for the building to be made out of leaves, which might burn up if your oven gets out of control. Likewise, a sweet shop maybe ought to be something that looks kind of fun, or a dress shop should look like it's owned by someone who has an eye for design. If it looks messy, then why would you go to the messy dressmaker shop? That wouldn't make sense. And something like a bookshop, you would want to maybe look cozy and warm. So based on those sort of general features, you can sketch a design for your overall building. Based on that sketch, you'll be able to plan out the sort of practical details and the sequence of the building. So on the practical side, you want to consider size. How big do you want your final product to be? Lighting is really important. Is your fairy garden building going to have lights inside or outside? If it does, are those lights going to be permanent or removable? And if they are going to be accessible, how do you get to them? If they're inside a building, then you need to have a little access door or some way that you can get in to replace the lights, or even to put them in the first place. The other side of it is that you need to kind of think through real basic engineering sort of concepts. So it needs to be strong enough to support the structure. You don't want it to crumple. So if you've got a stone facade, you need to think through, how is your stone facade going to be supported? Are you putting it into clay? Are you gluing it onto cardboard? Are you going to use some wire mesh or something to create the wall? All of those things are kind of, that we would consider in real life, actually have to be sort of scaled down so that you have something that stands on its own. And likewise, your base, whatever you build the whole structure on, needs to be able to support the weight of the final building. So if you're building a little stone house and you build it on some flimsy cardboard, it's probably going to break at some point because your base isn't sufficient to support the building. And then from there you can choose the materials that you plan to use, which you probably will have partially figured out by that point. But based on all of that, you'll want to think through as a last step just the sequencing of how you're going to build this. This is probably going to be a challenging step for a lot of people because you really have to work out the entire process and sort of imagine how you're going to do each step of the process. So you want to avoid doing things that will prevent you from doing other things you need to do. So for example, if you need to, if you'll have windows, and you can see through those windows into the inside, then you need to have the inside planned as well. And not only that, but you need to have made sure that you didn't assemble the overall outdoor structure, but with no way to get to the inside and finish the inside. Maybe that means that a door actually opens, or there's a piece that's removable, or there's an access door, or maybe it just means that you have to do all of the inside features before you actually mount your building to your base. Another idea is that you don't want to size your base, or like if you're using wood or cardboard, you don't want to cut it down necessarily right at the beginning, because that locks you into the size that you chose. You may find that things are bigger than you originally planned, and it may become more complicated if you have to force yourself to fit in a base size that you chose at the beginning. So try to think through those steps, and that should set you up for a general building design. And if you'd like to see how to take the design and turn it into the real thing, then stay tuned for some of my additional videos, which will be building some of my actual designed fairy buildings, starting with a bookstore, which is going to be an underground sort of nook that's built into the roots of a tree. Thanks for supporting Tickled Fancy Crafting by watching this video. Click the like button to let me know that you enjoyed the content, and subscribe to see new Tickled Fancy Crafting videos in your feed. If you'd like to be informed directly about the content, ring the notifications bell. Comment with crafts that you would like to see in the future, and remember, you can make this.